This book is called When the Body Says No. I became fascinated by the story of a British cellist. Her name was Jacqueline du Pré. You know something about her? Yeah. Jacqueline du Pré was a virtuoso and a child prodigy. So when she played in Toronto here, she's British, but she was an international star. When she played here in Toronto when she was 21 years old, people actually cried at her performance. They cried at her performance because her music was so emotional. She wasn't the typical sedate classical musician, you know. When she played, her whole body was into the music. She swayed, her long blonde hair flew in the air, and she poured all her emotions into her music. In fact, they talked about her cello voice, because she expressed all her emotions through her cello, but not in her real life. In her real life, she did not express emotions at all. She suppressed herself. She ended up with multiple sclerosis. By the time she was 27, she couldn't play anymore because she couldn't hold the bow anymore. So her career was very short. And you know what? She never wanted to become a virtuoso. She said, I don't want to become a cello virtuoso, she said, because it'll kill me. She knew it. And it did kill her. But she said, I can't give it up because so many people will be so disappointed if I did. And that's why she continued. When she was 7 or 8, she said to her sister Hillary, who also became a musician, not as great as Jackie was. Hill, she says, don't tell our mommy this, but when I grow up, I won't be able to move or walk. That's what happened. She became paralyzed with multiple sclerosis. She was 7 or 8. She said, don't tell our mommy this, but when I grow up, I won't be able to move or walk. Now, what do you notice about that? If you were 7 or 8 years old, or let me put it this way, if you had a child that was 7 or 8, and they were afraid that when they grow up, they'll be paralyzed, who would you want them to talk to about that? If you were the parent, you want them to talk to you. But by age 7 or 8, she knew that she had to protect her mother. She was a virtuoso, a prodigy, so she went to Russia, the land of classical music, to further her education. She was raped there. When she came back to Canada or to Britain, she said to her sister, Hill, don't tell our mommy this, but I was raped in Russia. Now why? It's because when she was born, still in the maternity hospital with her mother's father died. And her mother, who was a very troubled person herself, very close to her father, was totally grief-stricken. And guess what role the baby was given? What's that? To cheer her up, to be the mother's emotional support. So Jackie never was allowed to be her own person. She had to be like an extension of the mother. And her job was to support the mother emotionally. So they had this symbiotic relationship. And that's why she was always protecting her and not disappointing her. The story of Jacqueline du Pré, I talk about it in the second chapter of this book, When the Body Says No. And let me read you this paragraph here. 20 years after her childhood debut, now ill with multiple sclerosis, Jackie told a friend what she had felt on first finding herself on stage. Quote, it was as if until that moment, she had in front of her a brick wall which blocked her communication with the outside world. But the moment Jackie started to play for an audience, the brick wall vanished and she felt able to speak at last. It was a sensation that never left her when she performed. So the only time she could express herself was when she was on stage. And every other way she suppressed herself. In her marriage, in her relationships with her parents, she suppressed herself. Her sister said she was always the Jackie that circumstances demanded. So she was not herself. It wasn't authentic. It was always about the attachment. The piece I will play for you a little bit of is from the cello concerto by a British composer called Edward Elgar. Elgar was in his 60s when he wrote this, and this happened during the First World War. And the First World War was a time of terrible disillusionment, terrible carnage, terrible trauma. Tens of thousands of young people being killed every day in France in those terrible trench battles. And Elgar, the composer, was completely despondent. And he said, everything good and nice and clean and fresh and sweet is far away, never to return. He wrote that in 1917 when he wrote the concerto. He was in his 7th decade, in the twilight of his years. And his sister writes, Jackie's sister writes in her biography of her sister, Jackie's ability to portray the emotions of a man in the autumn of his life was one of her extraordinary and inexplicable capacities. Well, my comment is extraordinary, yes, but it's not inexplicable. Because by the time she was in her 20s, by the time she recorded this piece when she was 20 years old or 21 years old, Jackie was already in the twilight of her life. Within a few years, she wouldn't be able to play the cello anymore. And by the time she was in her early 40s, she would die of multiple sclerosis. And she knew that. Something inside her knew that already. She understood Elgar because she had partaken of the same suffering. His portrait always disturbed her. He had a miserable life hill, she told her sibling, and he was ill, yet throughout it all, he had a radiant soul, and that's what I feel in his music. Now, who do you think she was talking about? She was talking about herself, but she didn't recognize that. After she died, her sister listened to a performance of the same concerto on the BBC. It had been Jackie's final performance, public performance in Britain. A few moments of tuning, the sister writes, a short pause, and she began. I suddenly jumped. She was slowing the tempo down. A few more bars, and it became vividly clear. I knew exactly what was happening. Jackie, as always, was speaking through her cello. I could hear what she was saying. I could almost see tears on her face. She was saying goodbye to herself, playing her own requiem. Now, that's not the recording I'll play for you. The recording I'll play for you now is from when Jackie was 20 or 21 years old. And there are many beautiful performances of this piece, but none of them are as emotionally poignant, I think, as the way she plays it. So if you wouldn't mind playing that second track now on that CD. A bit louder, please. So then the question then is, how do these traits of suppressing emotions, not saying no, taking on responsibility for everybody else, not expressing your own needs, how do they lead to illness? Well, they lead to illness and burnout because physically they affect the body. They affect the body because it's now known that the mind and body can't be separated. So Western medicine, which has got great achievements, obviously, in many, many ways, miraculous in some ways, however, still falls into the deep error of separating the mind from the body. So when you, as I said earlier, when you go to the doctor with a rash, nobody's going to ask you about your life. And yet that rash says everything about your childhood and everything about how you live your life right now. When you go to the doctor with inflammation of your joints, they're not going to ask you about your relationships, about your work, about what you take on. Because we separate the mind from the body. Now, interestingly enough, it was right here in Canada that there was a very famous doctor in the late 19th century, early 20th century. His name was Sir William Osler, and his name is still revered in Canada. He's one of the greatest medical teachers of all times. And he said in 1892 that rheumatoid arthritis was a nervous system condition caused by worry and stress. And at that time, he had no proof. I mean, the science wasn't there yet. He just had his intuition. He also said that if I want to know whether a man will survive tuberculosis, I need to know not what's in his lungs, but what's in his head. He totally got the connection with emotions and the body. Modern medicine totally ignores it. If you look at the traditional medicinal practices of Aboriginal peoples in Canada, of tribal cultures in Africa, shamanic cultures in Latin America, traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine of India, the mind and body are seen as one unit. But Western medicine separates them. And this is despite the fact that we now have the science to prove that mind and body can't be separated. So it's not just that Western science doesn't see it. Western science sees it, but Western medicine doesn't accept it. Which is rather tragic, I think. Because we could be helping a lot more people in many, many more ways if we understood what our science is telling us. And what science is telling us is that the emotional centers in the brain are completely connected with the nervous system, the immune system, and the hormonal apparatus. So that whatever happens emotionally will show up in the nervous system, in our immune system, and in our hormones. Now, in a sense, that's totally obvious because again, if I were to threaten you right now, pulled a gun or shouted at you really loudly, your system would change in a split second. Physiologically, you'd be different people. Your heart rate would go up, your muscles would tense, you'd be higher cortisol levels, and so on. In other words, just because I shouted, your physically would be different because your emotions would be triggered. And emotions would trigger changes in your body. So that's obvious. But this happens 24/7. We're just not aware of it. So when you're suppressing yourself emotionally, when you're not being authentic, when you're not expressing yourself the way you need to be, when we take on stuff that doesn't belong to us, then we're actually suppressing ourselves physically because of the unity of all these systems. They can't be separated. How are they connected? They're connected, first of all, because the nervous system wires them together. So the nervous system is like a giant electrical grid that connects all organs and all systems in the body with the brain. So whatever happens, now, a large part of the brain is actually dedicated to attachment. This is through all our lives. You know, in an elderly couple, this is a study that was done not too long ago, amongst elderly couples who've been together for a long time, when one of them is hospitalized, what do you imagine happens to the other one? Somebody say it? They start getting sick. In fact, their chance of dying goes up quite a lot. Why? Because the immune system of the one person is dependent on the relationship with the other. Our mind and body can't be separated, and we can't be separated from an environment. So what happens emotionally shows up physically. So the nervous system wires all our bodies together with the brain. So whatever happens here, and whatever happens here, happens here. That's the first way. The second way is that each of these organs, each of these systems, the hormones, the nervous system, the immune system, puts chemicals into the circulation that go to the brain and are read by the brain. And the brain puts out chemicals that are read by these systems, so that the white cells in your circulation, the immune cells in your circulation, can manufacture every hormone that the brain can manufacture. So that your brain is talking to your immune system to 24/7. Immune system is talking to your brain 24/7. That's the second connection. The third connection, which I didn't even know about when I wrote this book 9 years ago, is that the heart has a brain. Did you know that? The heart has a nervous system. Surrounding the heart is a very fine network of nerves. And this network of nerves functions like a brain. It has predictive capacities, especially when something's bad going to happen. So when you say, I knew it in my heart, you did. You knew it in your heart. And the brain here, this nervous system in the heart, is connected to the brain up here. So they're talking to each other. So the heart is talking to the brain. That's the third connection. The fourth connection is that the brain puts out electromagnetic radiation. You can measure the brain waves electromagnetically. So does the heart. So when the two are in sync, then you're kind of together. When the two are not in sync, then you're kind of disorganized. That's the fourth connection. The fifth connection is the gut. Now the gut is, we think of it as an organ of digestion, which it is, but it's much more than that. It's much more than that. The gut is also an immune organ that protects you from bacteria and toxins. And it's also a sensory organ. It helps to read the environment. The gut sends many more messages to the brain than the brain sends to the gut. So that when we get gut feelings, it's because our guts are reading the environment. They get messages from the brain and they magnify those messages. So the question I asked last night, and I'll ask you again right now, this is a show of hands I'm going to ask for, okay? If you've had the following experience of having a powerful gut feeling about something and ignoring it and feeling sorry afterwards, please put your hand up. Okay? The majority, right? If you've had the opposite experience of having a strong gut feeling, ignoring it, and being grateful afterwards, now put your hand up. 1, 2, 3. Okay? So you see what the odds are. There's 60 people in the room here, roughly. So out of 60, 3 will have the experience of being glad they ignored their gut feelings, and close to 60 will be sorry that they ignored their gut feelings. In other words, the gut feelings have a chance of being right about 19 out of 20. So in any battle between the intellect and the gut's going to be right 95% of the time. In fact, I want to say that it's going to be right 100% of the time. And I'm going to say that the things that you thought were gut feelings were not gut feelings at all. They were just very strong emotions. What's that? You thought France would be Italy. That wasn't a gut feeling, that was just a misbelief. That wasn't a gut feeling. Yeah. France should have beat Italy, but Zinedine, but he was kicked out, you know. Yeah. So your gut feelings are actually right. Yeah. They should have beat Italy. But the point is, why is the gut going to be right all the time? Because the gut reads the whole environment. Gut feelings are not about just the words. Gut feelings are about what's going on in the big picture. So that when you ignore your gut feelings, you're ignoring the big picture, the whole of reality. Now, here's the deal, and we'll finish with this before lunch, is that when you put your hand up and you said that, yes, I had a gut feeling that I ignored, and I was sorry afterwards, you may not realize what you were telling me. But you were telling me the story of your childhood. Because have you ever met a 2-day-old baby that suppressed their gut feelings? Anybody ever see a 2-day-old that suppressed their gut feelings? You know, the 2-day-old is lying there, hungry and dirty and scared. And he's saying to himself, oh, I'm dirty and hungry and uncomfortable and scared, but mommy and daddy are working so hard. And I shouldn't bother them right now. Have you ever met such a 2-day-old? We are born totally connected to our gut feelings. When you put your hand up in response to the question that you suppressed the gut feeling, what you were telling me is that at some time or another, you learned that it was safer for you to to suppress your gut feelings than to stay connected to it. Why was it safer? Because your parents couldn't handle who you actually were. They couldn't handle who you were authentically, and in order to maintain the attachment relationship, you had to suppress your gut feelings, and therefore you had to suppress yourself. And that's the story of your childhood. And your parents did that not because they meant to. I did it to my kids, not because I meant to do it, but because I wasn't emotionally available and mature enough to handle their true selves. And so that's what happened to you. And so you learned, just like the people I've been talking about, that in order to maintain the attachment relationship, you had to stop being authentic. You had to disconnect from yourself. And then we take that into our job, see? And then all this stuff happens.